This is a story of fundamental deceit. The lies that you have been told. Sorry, but your parents may have misled you all along. And you are doing the same to your children. But then, you don't need to blame yourself. Because the society is dancing to a rhythm, following a pattern, but not teaching the realities on ground. Not telling the whole truth. But here, today, in this story, you know the truth that you have already faced with regrets and bitterness. Even if you are still unaware, watch and learn. As we dive into the second and ending part of the reality of life that you were never told. And you don't tell. Stay tuned.
Steve almost felt his hope dashed and his world collapsed in despair. But fate swung a pendulum of resurrection and rebirth in his mind, almost pounding against the wall of his skull. It was like saying to him, live or die, the choice is yours. Steve reasoned that his ego could just lead him to a wasteful death, but swallowing his pride and embrace humility could definitely align him on the path of life and success. He braced up and made a choice that he believed right then that he will never live to regret. He stepped into the hall while announcement and appreciations was still going on, and made his way straight to Kevin, while his heart pounded. "Sir," he said softly, and Kevin turned around to see him. Kevin excitedly spread his hands wide and wrapped them around Steve in a warm, joyful embrace. "Steve, so you are here. Good to see you. How have you been?" he asked, but before Steve could respond, Kevin hurriedly took a moment and excused himself from the others and walked with Steve to a more quiet spot. "So, how are you doing, my brother? Don't mind all this people. After all that you have explained in your lecture, they still want to see you and ask you the same question again," Kevin said. "You were asking me how I was doing, and that is why I am here," Steve said. Kevin took a pause and gazed thoughtfully at Steve for a few seconds. Then Steve continued, "Everything you said today, it felt like you were speaking directly to me. And about me." But Kevin simply smiled kindly. "That's because truth finds those who are ready to hear it, and certainly, it wasn't about you because I am just seeing you now for the first time after a long time. So I don't even know what is going on with you. So, tell me something." Steve told him his story, the awards and the certificates that Kevin obviously knew about, the rejections and the struggles. Kevin listened without interruption, then placed a firm hand on his shoulder and said, "You are not a failure, Steve. You are simply untrained in life's real curriculum. Your mind has been conditioned to chase certificates and awards, but not opportunities. Change your mindset, and you will change your destiny." Steve swallowed hard, his eyes moist. "But, where do I start from, and how?" he asked. Kevin chuckled. "Start small. Start with what you have. Learn skills, not just theories. Read books about money, business, and leadership. Find mentors. Don't be afraid to fail. Fail fast, fail forward. Every stumble is a step closer to strength. And most importantly, stop comparing your journey to others. Run your race." Those words lodged deep into Steve's soul. He walked out of the hall that day with no money in his pocket, no new job, no sudden miracle. But he carried something far greater, a spark of revelation. As he walked home, the city looked different. The streets, the shops, the people, all of it seemed to whisper possibilities he had never noticed before. For the first time in years, he felt hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Steve didn't know it yet, but that encounter had marked the beginning of his rebirth. The days that followed the seminar felt different for Steve. The streets he had walked 1,000 times suddenly appeared alive with unseen opportunities. He no longer looked at shops and markets the same way. Instead of just seeing sellers and buyers, he began asking himself, what value are they creating? How are they attracting money? For the first time in his life, Steve started keeping a notebook, not for academic notes, but for ideas. Random thoughts, business possibilities, and lessons from books he borrowed at the library, even observations about people. It wasn't easy, and in fact, the shift felt like trying to learn a new language after years of speaking only one. His first attempt at business was almost laughable. Using a little savings from his meager teaching salary, Steve bought a dozen phone accessories, chargers, earpieces, and power banks, from the market, intending to resell them at a profit. He stood outside his school after classes, trying to sell to parents and fellow teachers. The results? Disappointing. Some ignored him while others haggled until he made almost no profit. A few days later, half of the chargers stopped working, and complaints poured in. He refunded most of the money and was left with nothing but frustration. Old Steve would have quit right there. But the words of Kevin at the seminar echoed in his mind: fail fast, fail forward. Every stumble is a step closer to strength. So, Steve tried again. This time, instead of rushing into sales, he studied. He read books on business strategy, customer psychology, and financial management. He watched free online lectures late into the night. He asked questions from anyone who seemed to be doing well in small ventures. Slowly, his mindset began to change. One evening, while tutoring a student at home, he noticed the boy struggling with mathematics. Steve, being naturally gifted, explained it in a simple, creative way that made the boy's eyes light up. The boy's mother was impressed and she asked, "Why don't you start a proper tutorial class? Parents would pay good money for a teacher like you." The idea sparked in Steve's mind like fire. The very next week, he gathered a few desks and chairs in his small apartment. With borrowed markers and a makeshift whiteboard, he began his tutorial business. At first, only 3 students came and he charged a token fee, just enough to cover his bills. But he poured his heart into those lessons. Word spread. Within 2 months, he had 12 students, and by the end of the term, the population was over 30. For the first time since graduation, Steve was earning more than his teaching salary. More importantly, he was creating value, and people were willing to pay for it. The feeling was intoxicating, not in the way academic awards had been, but deeper. This wasn't applause for grades. This was respect for solving real problems. Parents thanked him, students admired him, and his wallet, though still modest, was finally beginning to breathe. But rebirth was not smooth. There were days he felt like giving up. Days when only 2 students showed up because others couldn't pay. Days when rent threatened to swallow his earnings. Days when self-doubt whispered, "You're still a failure." This is nothing compared to Kelvin. Yet Steve pushed forward. Each obstacle became a lesson, each small victory a brick in his rebuilding. He started saving. Not much, but enough to prove to himself that he could manage money. He invested in better materials for his classes. He partnered with a friend to print flyers and spread the word. By the following year, Steve had rented a small shop space, turning it into a proper tutorial center. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. The boy who once sat in darkness cursing his fate was now beginning to create light for others. One evening, sitting at his desk after dismissing his students, Steve opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence in bold letters. "School taught me how to pass exams, but life is teaching me how to build wealth." And for the first time in years, he smiled with genuine peace. Growth is never a straight line, it is a climb, steep and uneven, filled with slips, scrapes, and unexpected turns. For Steve, the climb began the day his tutorial center outgrew his tiny rented shop. At first, it was a good problem as more parents wanted to enroll their children than he had space for. But with growth came pressure, higher rent, the need for more desks, more teaching materials, and eventually, extra hands to help. Hiring his first assistant tutor was both terrifying and exhilarating, because paying someone else meant his profit would shrink. But it also freed his time to focus on expanding. It was a risk, and Steve had never been trained to take risks. School had always taught him to avoid mistakes. Again, he remembered the mentor's words, "The world belongs to those who dare," and so he dared. The first months nearly broke him. The new tutor wasn't as dedicated, and some parents complained. A rival tutorial center opened nearby, pulling away students. Bills mounted. At one point, Steve considered shutting everything down. He sat late at night, staring at his dwindling savings, the fear of failure gnawing at him. But then he remembered the old days, when rejection letters filled his inbox, when he couldn't afford food, when Kelvin had handed him money like charity. He refused to go back to that, and instead of quitting, Steve adapted. He learned marketing. He designed simple ads on social media, offering free trial classes. He added subjects beyond mathematics, partnering with other passionate young teachers who shared his vision, and also made effort to build relationships with parents, constantly seeking feedback. Slowly, the tide turned. Within a year, his tutorial center had doubled in size. He no longer taught in a cramped shop, he rented 2 floors of a small building. His staff grew from 1 assistant to 4. His earnings, though not millions, finally gave him dignity. He could afford to send money to his parents, dress decently, and even save toward the future. But more than the money, it was the mindset shift that thrilled him. He had begun to see the world differently. Opportunities were everywhere, hidden not in textbooks, but in problems waiting to be solved. Still, the climb was not without its bruises. 1 year after investing heavily in expanding his center, an unexpected government policy shut down all private coaching classes for 3 months. The losses nearly crippled him. Another time, a trusted employee stole part of the funds and disappeared. Each setback threatened to drag him back into despair, but Steve had changed. He no longer saw failure as the end. He saw it as tuition, the fees he had to pay to the real school of life. And so, each time he stumbled, he stood back up, wiser than before. It was during one of those setbacks that he found himself reading a book on entrepreneurship. In that book, he came across a line that says, "Do not build a business for money, but build it for impact. The money will follow value like a shadow follows light." That line struck him deeply, and that night, Steve redefined his purpose. His tutorial center was no longer just about survival, it was about transforming students who struggled the way he once watched Kelvin struggle. He wanted to prove that education could be more than exams, that learning could build confidence, not just grades. The change in vision electrified his work. And parents noticed the way students thrived. His reputation grew, and then, one sunny afternoon, Steve received a call that made him pause in disbelief. It was an invitation to speak at a youth seminar. Ironically, it was the same kind of seminar that had changed his life. The organizer had heard about his growing tutorial empire and wanted him to share his story, from first-class struggles to entrepreneurial growth. As Steve put down the phone, a lump formed in his throat. For years, he had watched Kelvin on stages, admired from a distance, and envied his applause. Now, life was turning the stage toward him, and the climb was far from over. The peak was still miles away. But Steve had finally found his footing on the mountain of life. The hall was packed, and rows of eager young faces stared at the stage, waiting for the speaker to arrive. For many of them, this was just another youth seminar, another chance to hear words that might spark something in their lives. But for Steve, standing backstage in a modest suit, heart pounding, it was a full-circle moment. He remembered the day he had stumbled into a hall just like this, broken, humiliated, and desperate for answers. He remembered standing outside, uninvited, and listening as a stranger shattered the illusions he had carried since childhood. That encounter had planted the seed that changed his life. And now, here he was, no longer the listener, but the voice. When his name was announced, the applause startled him. He stepped forward, gripping the microphone with trembling hands, scanning the sea of expectant eyes. For a brief moment, fear gripped him. What if I fail? But then, he smiled. Because failure was no longer his enemy, it was his teacher. He began softly. My name is Steve Dramani. Years ago, I was the boy everyone believed would conquer the world with his intelligence. I was the best in every class, the top graduate in my university. My parents, my teachers, even I believed that my brilliance would open every door. The audience leaned in. Steve's voice grew steadier. But when I stepped out into the real world, I discovered something that shattered me. Society doesn't reward grades, it rewards value. I had certificates, but I couldn't feed myself. I was broke, depressed, humiliated, while some of the very people who barely passed in school were thriving in life. Murmurs rippled through the audience and some nodded knowingly. I envied them. I hated myself. I even questioned whether life was fair. But here's what I learned: life isn't about fairness. Life is about principles. And those principles don't care about your GPA. They care about your mindset. He paused, scanning the room. Success in life is not a certificate you frame on the wall. Success is a mindset you practice daily. It's the ability to create value, to solve problems, to dare to fail, and to rise again. It is not about being the smartest student, it's about being the most resilient human. The room was silent now, hanging on every word. I built my first business with 3 students in my apartment. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. I failed so many times I lost count. But each failure became my tuition fee in the real school of life. And today, that little idea has grown into something that not only sustains me but also transforms young lives. His eyes softened. Do I make millions like some of my classmates? Not yet. But I have something far richer. Peace. I understand who I am, and I no longer measure myself by anyone's race but my own. That, my friends, is freedom. A long silence followed. Then, applause erupted. Not the shallow applause of grades announced in a classroom, but the deep, thunderous applause of people who felt the weight of truth. In that moment, Steve realized something profound: he no longer envied Kelvin. He no longer cursed his journey. Because he finally understood that success is not a competition, but a personal discovery. He smiled as he closed his speech. Your certificate is paper. Your true wealth is your mindset. Protect it, grow it, and life will open doors you never imagined. The standing ovation that followed was more than recognition, it was redemption. Steve walked off the stage, not as the golden boy who once failed to shine in the real world, but as a man who had finally found his light. The years rolled on and seasons changed. Cities grew busier. And so did Steve's life. What had begun as a small tutorial in his cramped apartment had blossomed into a thriving educational hub. His centers now spanned multiple neighborhoods, serving hundreds of students each year. Parents trusted him. Students admired him. And young teachers looked up to him as a mentor. Steve himself had grown, not just in status, but in spirit. He no longer carried the heavy cloak of comparison. The bitterness that once burned in his chest when he saw Kelvin's success had been replaced with quiet gratitude for his own path. One afternoon, Steve sat in his office, sunlight streaming through the window onto his desk. On the shelf behind him were rows of books, on business, leadership, finance, and philosophy. But on the topmost shelf sat something else, his old certificates. Framed, polished, but no longer worshipped. He looked at them and smiled. They were part of his story, but no longer the whole story. They were symbols of brilliance, yes, but also reminders of innocence, of lessons learned the hard way. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A young man walked in nervously, holding a folder of CVs. Sir, the young man began, I graduated last year. Top of my class. I've been applying for jobs everywhere, but nothing is working. Honestly, I don't know what else to do. Steve's heart softened. He saw himself in the boy, the pride, the despair, the silent question, why isn't life rewarding me for my grades? He gestured for the young man to sit. I know how you feel, Steve said gently. I've walked that road. But listen carefully, your grades are not your destiny. They are only proof of discipline. If you want to succeed, you must go beyond them. You must learn to think differently, to see opportunities, to create value. The young man listened, eyes wide. Steve leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Life does not pay you for what you know, but it pays you for what you can do. Learn skills and take risks, and most importantly, be willing to fail. Build resilience. That is how you build wealth, not just money, but purpose. The boy nodded slowly, something flickering in his eyes, the same spark Steve had once felt in that seminar hall years ago. As the young man left, Steve leaned back in his chair, a deep peace washing over him. He was no longer just surviving. He was planting seeds in others, just as someone had once planted in him. The torturous climb of yesterday had become the platform of today. Steve whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, to be successful in life is not just about your scores in school. The mindset of a billionaire comes in a different approach to life. And that mindset, I will spend the rest of my days teaching it. Outside, the laughter of children drifted through the window from the tutorial hall. It was the sound of hope, of futures being rewritten. And for Steve, it was the sweetest music of all.
Please, don't forget to subscribe and share this story. Drop your opinion about this topic and say your mind. I know that this story resonates with you or someone you know. We all can school each other from your comments. Stay blessed.